Hello, everybody, and I hope you're having a blessed day. And I hope that you will listen to all of this video. I know it's a little bit longer than what I usually do, but we're going to talk about the Depression and how they survived and how they got through it. And it was a lot harder than most of us really understand. We all have fond memories of stories that we were told, but it's different than living through it. Back then, they didn't have food stamps or even Social Security. And that could happen again. When we look at what we're going through right now in this country, if we do not get people back to work and get enough people working again and taxes coming in, they will have to cut programs. They'll have no other choice because there'll be no money there. One of the things they encouraged the farmers to do at that time was to euthanize their animals because they had far too many and people could not afford the meat and the farmer could not afford to feed the animals during the Depression. And that's exactly what they're doing to our animals right now. They're euthanizing them. They're not making it to the markets. Now, back during the Depression, most people had 2 wood stoves. One was outside, and that's where they cooked in the summer because they did not have air conditioners or fans that ran off of electricity. And so they had one outside to cook on, and their cookware was all cast iron because sometimes they would even make biscuits in a Dutch oven, and they would dig a hole in the ground and get some wood going in that hole, and they'd set that Dutch oven on top of it. And of course, once the wood was burning nice and hot, they would take some of that wood and put it around the top and the edges of it also to help cook those biscuits. So having cast iron was extremely important. And me personally, that's all I cook with is cast iron. And they also had a stove in their kitchen. Now that helped heat the house in the winter to get them through, and also, they could cook and heat the house at the same time. They had a really rough life. Many people did not have tractors, farm tractors, like we have today where you can just go in and till your ground under and plant your garden. They have, a lot of people had chickens, eggs, but they didn't get as many eggs as we do today. And so they had very few, and they didn't, I like myself, I got like 20 chickens. My grandmother only had like 5 or 6 because usually something got butchered to eat. They weren't, they couldn't keep them. And so that meant less eggs. And she sometimes would let a hen sit, and that meant even less eggs, but she hoped that she would get a couple of roosters out of it that she would be able to butcher and cook. Even though they were on farms, feed was hard to come by, and not everybody could afford a cow or had pasture for it. So my grandmother raised pigs, only one to butcher. And of course she had a garden every year, like most people did. But even a garden didn't guarantee her that they were going to have enough food to get them through. It just didn't. There was bad weather back then, tornadoes. Tornadoes were very prominent where my grandmother lived. And it was not uncommon to lose a garden to one. So it was not always an easy life or a guaranteed life just because you grew a garden. And so that's a problem that we have today. Now, I started a garden this year because for 4 or 5 years I've had hail. And I've been praying, and I mean really praying, that my garden makes it. It's just some squash and some watermelon. My grandmother grew squash too. She used to have fried squash for breakfast, and I do too. There's some things my grandmother did that I've actually copied and do myself, and I learned from it. But they had an extremely hard life. Some people, even when the Depression was over, never really got over living through that. My mother was one of them. She wanted nothing to do with farming. As soon as she could get up and grown and get away from my grandmother, she headed for the big city of Illinois. She just wanted no part of farming. And my father loved farming. My parents had over 200 acres of land. And he loved to farm, but my mother hated it. She wanted no food that came off of a farm. She would not even eat a chicken egg, even though she ate them when she grew up. And I think it was due to the Depression. It really affected her. Because I remember the stories of her telling me that they would eat eel and rattlesnakes and frogs, frog legs, that they hunted that kind of thing for meat. Because, there's just not enough chickens to go around to feed your family every day. And they didn't have the pasture for cows. Now, they had a pig, but, back then they usually had really large families, and my grandmother had a very large family. She had 11 girls and no husband because he died of tuberculosis. So she was raising those girls by herself. So that meant poverty and poorness and hard work. I remember stories of my mother when my grandmother would tell me that she would ride the plow horse and there was no saddle because they couldn't afford it. My mother would get blisters on her rear end so bad that she could not sit in a chair without having a pillow. And so that's a really, really hard life to have to, ride a plow horse. Because there was no gas. People couldn't afford it back then. Even those who might have had equipment that ran off of gas, where were they going to get the money for it? And so they had an extremely, extremely difficult time. No fans, no air conditioning. Wetting sheets or whatever they could get their hands on to put it over a window to help when the breeze did hit to cool off the house a little bit. That's why they cooked in their wood stoves outside. I remember my grandmother telling me that sometimes she would just open a jar of tomatoes, put salt and pepper on it, and that's what they ate. See, they ate whatever they could get their hands on. And everybody had a different story. See, my grandmother didn't have any fruit trees. But there was a man telling a story that his family had a lot of fruit trees, peaches. And that's all they had to eat was peaches. Why they didn't have a garden, I don't know. I did, at the time, I never thought to ask. But they had nothing to eat but peaches. And he said his mother would can them so they'd have peaches to help get him through the winter. He was never able to eat another peach in his adult life because he ate nothing but peaches during the Depression. I've heard stories, a lady was telling me, that when she was a kid, she would have to climb mountains because they went to go get cactus, and the type of cactus that they ate grew on the mountains. She was a little kid. She hated it. And they'd have to get enough to do them a couple of days so they could rest at least one day. And she said all they had was they would make flour tortillas, and they would eat cactus petals and mix it with beans, refried beans. And for 5-6 months, that's all they ate was burritos. I remember her telling me a story. She'd have to get up and make 4 and 5 dozen of tortillas in one day because they had such large families. And, stop and think about it. You got a family of 4 and they eat 2 or 3 burritos. You're talking a couple of dozen of tortillas, and that's just one meal. And so they had to make enough to do them for the entire day. My grandmother, when they didn't have butter, stop and think. Well, there was no such thing as a baked potato with sour cream and butter. I remember my grandmother would boil a potato and cut it open, and she would take a couple of spoons of hot bacon grease and pour over it and put salt and pepper. And by the way, it does taste good because she was like, try it. But that's how she did it during the Depression. She would raise pork, a hog, and she would can the sausage. She would, grind up her sausage and can it. But you know what? It didn't last forever. 11 kids she had. Stop and think how much sausage it must have taken for breakfast. And so she would run out of that, and she would salt cure hams. See, where she lived, they didn't smoke them. They just salt cured them. They entire salt all over that ham. Of course, the ham tasted salty, but they were used to it. They'd rinse it off and sometimes boil it in water, but they would fry it. That ham, the slice of that ham, they would fry in a little bit of lard. And then once that ham was cooked, they would take that grease from that ham and pour a cup of coffee in it. And they called it red-eye gravy. And they would dip their biscuits in it. Now, I've eaten it, and it's actually good. I can't eat it now because it would give me heartburn really bad. But that is the kind of things that they did that, we don't stop and think of how difficult things are really going to get if we hit the kind of depression, and I do believe that we're going to, and maybe even worse than they did. And how would we make it through? Because we've been so accustomed of eating what we have a taste for, yet they didn't have that. They had to prepare ahead of time. I mean, my grandmother said that people at the church would take turns to invite the pastor and his family over to eat, to help in some way to help take care of the pastor. Well, you know what? When they knew they were going to have that, they had to plan ahead. If they were going to fry a chicken, well, they had to make sure they had one available and butcher it. And then, if they made a cake or a pie, they had to make sure they had enough flour put aside, enough sugar put aside to do that sort of thing. And even cakes back then, they didn't have oil. All cakes my grandmother always made were made from lard. She had a recipe book that was given to me, and it's full of recipes of making cake from lard because in those days, there wasn't oil. And the cakes taste really good. I've made them before, and they are good because I've been out of oil and decided, I've got lard. I'll go ahead and make a cake from it. And it's good. And so they did do a lot of planning ahead. And when they would, get feed sacks with a flour, or they were made from burlap. And when they sometimes had money, because they did get their hands on cash. Some people, the children, would go and work in some other farm or, field, and they would make $1 or $2. And so they did buy sometimes like chicken scratch or a bag of flour. Those burlap sacks, they made clothes from them, dresses, and even panties. I remember stories of my mother telling me that my grandmother used to make them panties. And there was a special way that she would work that burlap to make it soft so it wouldn't be so itchy. And so, that's a pretty hard life to live that way. And it could happen to us today. It could. And, all I can do is, I pray over my garden every day. And I watch it and keep an eye on it and make sure it's got enough water so nothing happens to it. Because it may be all I have to survive off. We don't know. Might not be able to get anything else at the stores. A lot of people are having difficulty, especially with everything that's going on right now. And I can tell you stories of, my grandmother saying all they had was black-eyed peas to eat. Or sometimes nothing but a piece of bread with jelly on it. And so it wasn't all good. Yes, sometimes, when the garden came in, they had some fried okra and, a little bit more variety. But when winter came, they had to be extremely careful. They had to. And what meat, eating eel, I wouldn't even know how myself. I'd be like, how do you peel the eel, or what do you do with it, or, how do you cook it? But they did. And we would be stuck in that same kind of circumstances. That's why I keep goats, because at least I know how to butcher and take care of a goat. And I do have a way to take care of them. If I couldn't get hay at the store or something, I still have a way to feed them. And those are things that we need to stop and think about. What happens if we woke up tomorrow and could no longer get anything from a store? We didn't have the money. We didn't have a job anymore. How would we live? No electricity, no running water, no gas for our cars. How would we make it? We would have to go back and do the same things that they did. Would we have to climb mountains to find our food? My grandmother went out and picked wild berries wherever she could find them to make jams and jellies. I don't have any wild berries that even grow around where I live. There's other things wild I could get my hands on. But that's the kind of life that we would, be looking at living. And it would be difficult and hard on us. But I'm going to show you something that my grandmother taught me. Because, we all sometimes start seeds. I mostly, if I do seeds, it's usually tomato seeds. And because if I plant them outside, I've had ants carry them off. I mean, literally I've watched ants walking away with my tomato seeds. And this is the tube from toilet paper. And you want to cut it in half because it'll make you 2 little pots to start seeds in. And what you're going to do is at the bottom, you're going to cut 4 slits almost halfway up. You're going to cut 4. And because what you want to do is tuck that under, because you want to push it close together, those cuts that you've done, when you push it down to cover the bottom so that there's no hole in the bottom. And see how I'm cutting that with the scissors? And you're not cut up high enough, and you may have to cut it just a little bit higher, because you want to make sure that you cover the bottom. And then what you do, I just go out in my yard, because I always have, goat poop and different things, a pile of it, and I'll bring some in, and I fill it in one of these little containers. And then I will put water in it, to soak, so that the soil and the compost and everything kind of soaks up into it. And then on the top, I'll lay my seed. And then I'll put a little soil on top of the seed, and I'll put a little more water on top of it so it dampens the top and it wets the seed. And you want to be careful. You don't want to run water into it full force. You want to be real careful that you do it real slow and gentle, so that you're not destroying your seed as you water. I don't water this from the bottom. I water it from the top, and very slow and gentle, just small drips. And I'm going to do 2 of these. And it does work. I've done this with tomatoes. And once the tomato gets like the 2nd leaf on it, or the 3rd, I'll take that, open the bottom, but I make sure I water it first. Then I'll open the bottom of that, and I'll dig a hole in my garden wherever I'm going to plant my tomatoes at. And I'll put it down in there, and I want that little carton covered completely. And what I'll do is, when I cover it completely, I'll take a gallon, an empty gallon, because I save my milk bottles, gallons, whatever you want to call them, and I'll cut the bottom of that out, and I'll put it over the top of that little tomato plant, and I'll put a little bit of dirt around it so it'll stay in place if I get some winds, because in the mornings here in May or April, the mornings are still very cold and cool. And so, tomatoes don't like that kind of cool, so it kind of creates a little greenhouse for them and keeps them warm and protects them from the wind and protects them bugs and rabbits or whatever, might get in there. And then I cover them, and I let them go inside that gallon until they're almost to the top coming out, and then I'll lift the gallon off of them, and of course then I'll put my tomato cage around them. So, well, I hope you found this tip helpful, and just keep praying and put away what you can now, because I'm going to do more and give you, more ideas and more information, But how we make it through a depression is really, we don't know. We don't know, would we be able to get our hands on potatoes? Or would it just be a package of hot dogs? Or, is it only going to be eggs we'll be able to get? We just don't know. And that's the way it was for them too. And the garden, yes, helps. But what do we do if we have a really bad year and there's not enough? So, and not everybody can have a garden. You got a lot of people living in the city. They do. And some people don't have enough land. My problem is water. I do not have enough water to grow an extremely large garden. One that would be big enough to feed my family. I don't have that kind of water. I just don't. So I would have problems. I would. But God bless you guys and have a blessed day.